Well, good morning. My name is Richard Rosengarten, and I teach religion, literature, and visual culture here. I send greetings on behalf of Dean David Nierenberg, who isn't able to join us today, but is really pleased by your presence here and excited by what we're going to engage in. Welcome to Global Christianities, Perspectives, Methods, and Challenges, the second in a series of 5 conferences to be held over these 5 years at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, to think forward about the phenomenon of Christianity as one of the fastest growing religions in the world, and to aim to foster and to promote a thoughtful kind of conversation about that phenomenon, about its complexity, about its internationality, and about the ways it ought to help us to rethink how we consider the role of Christianity in global society today. Towards that end, we have a program that includes scholars in theology, history, classics, history of religions, and the like, to help us think forward and to index for us in general the various vortices through which one can think about this phenomenon. I have 2 happy tasks. One is to thank Tandean Rustandy, who is with us today, and who is the person who is supporting these meetings and has become a great friend and benefactor of the Divinity School. Welcome, Mr. Rustandy, and thank you. And secondly, to thank cherished colleagues at the Divinity School who have taken a major role in the planning of these events, and some of whom at least you will meet throughout the day: Professor Kevin Hector, Professor Angie Hupp, Professor Dwight Hopkins, and Professor Karen Krause. I also want to say a word of thanks to Sarah Bigger, who is by the door and in an appropriate stance, since I think of her as sentry for all these activities. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Kevin Hector and let the fun begin. And again, welcome.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Hector. I teach theology and philosophy of religions here. It is no exaggeration to say that when the Global Christianities Committee got together to talk about who in the world we would be most excited to get together, and we dreamed big dreams, we couldn't have imagined that we would be able to put together a slate of speakers that we have this morning. This will only resonate with some of you, but it reminded me of if I invited all of the Avengers to my kid's birthday party and they all came. It's an honor for me. It's truly an honor. I'm humbled to get to introduce the speakers for this morning's session. I will introduce them in turn. They will each give a talk, and then we will have discussion of both talks together. So I would encourage you to write down your questions. Our first speaker is Dr. Kwok Dr. Kwok is the former William F. Cole Professor of Christian Theology and Spirituality at Episcopal Divinity School. She has also taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Auburn Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, and Yale Divinity School, and is currently teaching at Emory University. Professor Kwok's research focuses on Asian feminist theology and postcolonial theology. She has written or edited 20 books in English and Chinese. If I went through all of the things that deserve to be said, there wouldn't be time for her paper. But here are some of them. Occupy Religion, Theology of the Multitude, Postcolonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, Introducing Asian Feminist Theology, Discovering the Bible in the Non-Biblical World, and Chinese Women and Christianity, History 1860 to 1927. Professor Kwok has also received multiple honorary doctorates, is a past president of the American Academy of Religion, and is co-founder of the Pacific Asian North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry Network. Her paper this morning is entitled The Study of World Christianity from a Postcolonial Perspective. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kwok.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I am delighted to have this opportunity to learn from my colleagues about this very important topic, global Christianities, perspectives, methods, as well as challenges. The title of my paper is The Study of World Christianity from a Postcolonial Perspective. I want to ask the audience, how many of you have been to a church in China? We have a few. Were they full? Very full, okay. So several years ago, I had the opportunity of visiting this megachurch that is called Chongyi Church in Hangzhou, China. The sanctuary can seat 5,000 people. It was all full, even before the service began. We were told 1,000 children and young people attended the Sunday school, and the team of Sunday school teachers was more than 100. Wow! This phenomenal growth of churches in communist China has caught many by surprise. The official statistics put the number of Christians in China to be around 25 to 30 million. But the unofficial figure ranged somewhere between 80 to 100 million, if we counted those who belonged to the house churches. So China is poised to be the country with the highest number of Christians in the world. World Christianity as a field has moved away from a Euro or Euro-American centered interpretation of Christianity and recognized the global configurations of Christianity in all its diversity and complexities. The Christian demographics, as many of us know, has shifted to the global south. By 2025, half of the Christian population will live in Latin America and Africa. Another 17% will live in Asia. Only 1 out of 5 will be non-Latino whites. So what can be learned from this changing demographic, and how can the study of Chinese Christianity contribute to our understanding of world Christianity? Here, I wanted to introduce to you this eminent scholar of Chinese history. In 1984, Professor Paul A. Cohen published this very important book, Discovering History in China, in which he discussed different models of the study of Chinese history in the West. The first model he called the Western Impact Chinese Response model, which treats the Chinese as passive and reactive in the historical encounter. Using this model to study world Christianity, the focus will be on the role of missionaries, while downplaying the agency of Chinese Christians. The second model, he calls it the cultural imperialism model, which treats Chinese Christian mission as an integral part of Western domination. This has been the dominant view in the historiography of Chinese mission in China after 1949. But since the late 70s, other interpretations began to emerge. Chinese scholars, such as Wang Lixin, has reassessed the legacy of Christian mission, the contribution of Christian colleges, and the encounter between Chinese women and Christianity. Paul Cohen criticized these two models and suggests a third. He calls it the China-centered model, which begins with Chinese problems set in a Chinese context and seeks to understand the internal structure or direction to Chinese history that precedes from the earlier centuries. So instead of beginning from the West, as in the Western impact or cultural imperialism model, this third model begins with the Chinese as the protagonist of the unfolding drama of the interaction between Christianity and Chinese society. Taking the cue from Cohen, we will look at the development of Chinese Christianity from the very beginning, and not from the time when Western missionaries arrived in China. This is the ancient Silk Road, all the way from Turkey and Syria, from the west to Chang'an, the ancient capital of China. So along the Silk Road, you have the interaction or cultural exchange between the Christians, the Buddhists, the Muslims, and other religious traditions for a very long time. Some of the leading postcolonial theorists hailed along the Silk Road. This is Jerusalem, where Edward Said was born and later grew up in Egypt. This is the present-day Mumbai, called Bombay, where Homi Bhabha, the author of The Location of Culture, came from. And this is Calcutta, where Gayatri Spivak, another leading post-colonial theorist, grew up and attended high school. So I suggest it is no coincidence. Some of the leading post-colonial theorists will be theorizing from the multiplicity of culture and the interplay of different religious traditions. So today, I propose a post-colonial cross-cultural approach to the study of world Christianity. It has three characteristics. The first one, Christianity was a hybrid phenomenon from the very beginning. Therefore, it requires a cross-cultural and inter-religious approach to study it. The missionary movement is part of global modernity. And then we need to use a comparative approach to study Christianity from the South to the South. My first point, hybrid Christianity. As many of us know, Christianity emerged from the Jewish and Gentile communities influenced by Hellenistic culture living in the Roman Empire. From the beginning, it was a cultural hybrid, negotiating with and integrating various cultural and religious elements. During the missionary movement that Paul initiated, he went along the Mediterranean and then traveled in Asia Minor. Unfortunately, history has been taught from the Mediterranean and then took a big leap to Europe and then to America, and then forgot there was another branch that was ancient and important. You know, it is this root, the Church of the East. Before Christianity was dominant in the North, let us not forget, it traveled to the South, to Africa, and to the East, along the Silk Road. Christianity spread with commerce, with missionary activities, and also with intercultural exchange. Here you can see the metropolitan centers of this spread of Christianity to the East. So then, if we pay attention to the development of missionary activities in the Church of the East, we will recognize Christianity reached India and China very early on. Some even believed that St. Thomas himself went to Kerala, India, and died as a martyr there in the 1st century. We do not know whether that legend can be proved. But here, I'm showing you this St. Thomas cross in Kerala, India. The earliest type of these crosses can be found as way back as the 8th century. You can see the cross was on top of the lotus, a very important symbol for Buddhism. And then it shows an arch too, the door. What is it? Well, according to Gudrun Lola, this cross appears to be surrounded by a Pharan, an ornamental archway known in Buddhist and Hindu temples. And then, if we travel further east, and then you will come to Chang'an, the ancient capital of China. Here, you have the famous Nestorian tablet. Syrian missionaries arrived as early as the 7th century, and this tablet detailed their activities, which also showed a cross on top of a lotus flower. Before I show you the cross, let us remind ourselves of the spread of Buddhism. And here you have the cross. Again, you have the Nestorian cross on top of the lotus. This art historian, Laura, says this type of cross is more a sign of the resurrected and cosmic Christ than of the dead one. The development of Christianity in India and China show that the Christian messages and even symbolisms had to be translated into the vernacular and local idioms. As the late Professor Naman Sane has reminded us, the translation of Christian message across different cultures and religions has given rise to tremendous plurality and diversity of expression in world Christianity. This means that Christianity has always been polycentric and has been reconstituted and reimagined in diverse cultures. Here I want to quote Professor Titi Tianliu. Polycentric Christianity is Christian faith with many cultural homes. The fact that Christianity is at home in a multiplicity of cultures without being permanently wedded to any of them presents for Christians everywhere a unique opportunity for examining Christian identity and Christian theology. I had the opportunity to read the Chinese on the Nestorian tablet. It talks about Trinity, it talks about baptism, but it did not talk about the suffering or the crucifixion. Why? In 7th century China, influenced by Buddhism, it would have been difficult for the Chinese to understand how a dead man hanging on the cross will be surviving. Can you see that even within theology, not just artistic symbol, there has been adaptation from early on. Now I come to my second point, global modernity. In the 8th century, Rome turned its attention to the north and formed alliances with the Germanic people. From the 8th century to the 15th century, Christianity expanded in the north and west, while as the Church of the East shrank. So many would associate Christianity with Western civilization, and it spread to different parts of the world through commerce, colonialism, and Christian missions. Now, Christian missionary activities were an integral part of the civilizing mission of the West, while indigenous cultures in the Americas, Africa, or Asia were denigrated as backward and inferior. There is this binary construction in the study of world history. Some societies are or were designated as traditional, while other societies would be seen as modern. It is important to remember what Edward Said, one of the pioneers in postcolonial studies, has reminded us in his book Orientalism, published in 1978, and I quote, "Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient." Here, he meant the Middle East. Dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. This Orientalist biases is clearly evident in the works of an earlier generation of missionaries and scholars who studied the Christian missionary movement in China. Here, you have the volume published in 1922 with the unfortunate title, "The Christian Occupation of China," which detailed missionary activities, the scope and extent of their work in China. Later, we have the almost classic text on the history of Christian missions in China, written by Kenneth Latourette. So thick, really classic. Both, though not the same, but certainly will think the Western missionaries had done great service in emancipating China. So now, given that we are learning from the postcolonial theorists not to construct tradition and modernity in binary way, how can we look at modernity anew? Here, let me cite three possibilities. This first one treats Latin America, Africa, the Pacific, or other non-Western societies as occupying the underside of modernity. Del Irvin used this. So there is modernity defined by Western advanced industrialization, and then because of colonization, there was an underside. The second one, proposed by Erica Dussault, following Menino, then it constructed modernity as not just one process, but two processes, which are joined together. The formation of the modernity could not happen without the colonization of vast population of the world. That is why you have a slash, modernity and coloniality. I would like to propose, from colleagues who have studied Chinese history, a third possibility that is called global modernity. Here, I want to cite a Turkish scholar who has devoted his professional career studying China. Modernity all along has been global in scope, plural in form and direction, and hybrid not only across cultural boundaries, but also in the relationship of the modern to the traditional. It is important to highlight modernity as global in scope. Extending this study to world Christianity, Ryan Dunge says, the local agents and host environment exerted influences in the adaptation, negotiation, and adjustment of missionary efforts and intercultural communication. He continues, recognition of the agency exercised by the recipient society is a major reason why cultural differentiation is now seen as part of globalization along with homogenization. Because every claim universal is translated into existing cultural matrices in which it can take on different meanings or be employed in different ways. Now let me come back to cite China as an example. Scholars often credit missionaries for introducing Western notions of womanhood, regarded as enlightened and modern, in contrast to those in traditional Chinese culture. Such generalization overlooks that both Chinese and Western understanding of womanhood changed over time. Women missionaries who came to China in the 19th and early 20th century were influenced by the ideals of womanhood and evangelical view of domesticity of the Victorian period. In the United States, women missionaries were influenced by the cult of womanhood, which could be characterized by piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. They saw the Chinese customs of foot binding, concubinage, and arranged marriage incompatible with their ideal of monogamous marriage and educated womanhood. They were often credited with bringing more egalitarian views of the sexes to the Chinese society. Yet, back home, they were considered traditional by the more radical feminists. Here you have the picture of domesticity. Can you contrast this with this picture? Which one is more radical? That is why Marjorie King argues that 19th century American women missionaries exported Western notions of domesticity and did not contradict the Chinese notion that women's place was in the home. The missionaries did not export any kind of feminism understood by their counterparts in the US at that time to China. They even included sewing or embroidery or domestic work in the curriculum for women's girls' schools. Now, the situation of China changed very rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th century. This year, we as Chinese commemorated the May 4th movement, the centennial of this important student protest against Western imperialism in China. So female students took to the street 100 years ago in May to protest with their male counterparts foreign aggression. And as they were protesting, what did their women missionary teacher tell them? Did they encourage them to protest? Give a guess. Not quite. They were not the radical ones back home. They were not eager to support the students under their tutelage to be protesters or to fight for Chinese salvation. So, today, when we look at this past history, would we say simply Western women missionaries, they brought modern notions of womanhood to China? The story was much more complicated. The evangelical ideals that wives should be educated, keep the house tidy and clean, and help their husbands reflected Western response to the Industrial Revolution and other social changes. Chinese notions about womanhood affected missionary visions and their strategies working with women. Some of the women missionaries changed their views of looking at the world and themselves after working for a long time in China. In one particular case, it was the change in women's leadership in the church that changed the whole world Anglican Communion. Here is a picture in 1945. In the center of the picture is the Reverend Florence Lee Emory, who was ordained to be the first women priest in the worldwide communion in 1944. And then, because of the controversy surrounding her ordination, the people in UK, United Kingdom, said we had to investigate, learn something about it, and there was also a push within United Kingdom to have women being considered to be priests. So it was not UK influenced China, it was the other way around. In case you have forgotten, it was not until 1992 that the Church of England allowed women to be ordained, decades afterwards. So I move on to my third point, comparative study from South to South. Both the Christian impact, indigenous response, and the cultural imperialism models of studying world Christianity focus on the relations between the global north and individual countries or societies of the global south. The study of world Christianity has called our attention to local agencies. In the past decades, we have produced many important works that study Christianity from the global south. 30 years ago, when I began to do the research on Chinese women and Christianity, there were very few comparable studies. I had to borrow the insights from those who were studying African American women in the United States to learn how to do this. Today, I am happy to report there are many more studies that talks about women's interaction with Christianity from the global south. That is why the time has come for not just London and Shanghai or New York and Fuzhou, that kind of study. We should be learning China, India, China, Iran, China, and Uganda. How can we do it? Let me just give an example. The Church Missionary Society, a society organized by the Anglican Church, has been involved in many parts of the world, in mission work. 3 important foci of their work. 1, evangelism. 2, education. 3, medicine. So here we have a scholar, Francis de Guigny, who has studied religious feminism in an age of empire, CMS women missionaries in Iran. So if we compare the situation of women's work in Iran and China, we will notice 2 very important observations. 1, the use of female education to gain access to the populace. 2nd, we certainly want to know in what way Christianity interacts with the religious traditions in China or in Iran. In China, most of the early converts, they came from practicing Chinese popular religion. In Iran, certainly it was the Muslim tradition that was dominant. So a cross-cultural study between these societies would find how women negotiated multiple religious identities, communal pressure, family pressure in becoming Christian. Let me move on to India. In India, as in China, the early converts came from the lower class, while the established elites would not allow their women or their daughters to follow a foreign religion. So it would be of interest to study how the lower class women in China became interested in Christianity, and to compare and contrast how Dalit women from India were particularly interested in joining the church. Why? They had very little to lose, isn't it? Because they could then learn to read, they could become Bible women, and they could even teach the higher caste women how to read. So for them, it might be a chance to improve their social mobility, to give themselves a better chance of life. Now I want to talk about China and Africa, because in these two contexts, we had numerous studies or discussion on how the CMS missionaries or the missionary societies had tried to deal or failed to deal with a very important question, that is polygamy. In China, in the 19th century, the richer families the husband had more than one wife. And in Africa, even today, in some societies, we have polygamous marriages. Now, how did the missionaries respond to that situation? In China, and also, for example, in Uganda, the CMS missionaries, they had to be very careful. On the one hand, they did not want to then stir up trouble. The elites, the men who had power, they would not want missionaries to change this practice. But on the other hand, many of the missionaries subscribed to nuclear monogamous family. So it would be very useful and interesting to compare and contrast how women in these two societies negotiate with new religious identity, new forms of teachings about marriage and family, and new understandings of womanhood. So in conclusion, I want to suggest we need dynamic and interactive frameworks that recognize multiple possibilities, fluid frontiers, and creative adaptations in the study of world Christianity. We need to emphasize on the receptors rather than the transmitters, and on local agencies in the missionary and indigenous encounter. As Ryan Dench reminds us, homogenization and differentiation are simultaneous and mutually conditioning dimensions of globalization. The study of world Christianity can contribute to our understanding of the construction of a modern order that is an ongoing global cultural process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwok, for an eminently compelling and clear paper. Our next speaker is Dr. Jacob Olupona. Dr. Olupona is Professor of African American Religious Traditions at Harvard Divinity School. His books include City of 201 Gods, Ife in Time, Space, and the Imagination, Orisa Devotion as World Religion, The Globalization of Yoruba Religious Culture, and Kingship, Religion, and Rituals in a Nigerian Community, a phenomenological study of Ondo Yoruba festivals. Professor Olupona was named one of the Walter Channing Cabot Fellows in 2012. He's been awarded the Nigerian National Order of Merit. He's been awarded the Martin Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion. He's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, on an honorary doctorate, and countless other honors. His paper this morning is entitled Global Christianity, Challenges, Concepts, and Prospects. Please join me in welcoming Professor Olupona.
Good morning to you all. I guess it's still morning.
Yes.
I'm sorry I couldn't start with you. I had another assignment to virtually connect with Harvard University that is responsible for giving me my daily bread. But it's unbelievable that the meeting was about the creation of a new program or initiative called the Global Task Force to think about where Harvard Divinity should be moving and how Harvard Divinity School should respond to some of the issues that we're talking about. So I seized the opportunity to tell them what we are doing here today. And it's an honor to be invited. I want to thank the donor for making this possible. And I want to thank my friends and colleagues at the University of Chicago. And for me, it's a particularly important visit because since I was given the Matthew Award by the AR in the Public Understanding of Religion, I wanted to sort of come to visit Chicago and visit the institution where Matthew works. So thank you very much. World Christianity, the African experience. In the old schema of the history of religions, Christianity has always been considered one of the major world religions. What is new about invoking Christianity as a world religion in the 21st century is the question that we all need to address. The answer partly has to do with the major centers or locales of religion and how they have shifted in significant ways in recent times. Christianity in the global south, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, has become a major player, decisively shaping the contours of Christianity in the world today. And what does it mean to theorize and teach from the global south perspective? As one scholar puts it, what are the promises and limitations of the paradigm of the global south? The truth of the matter, of course, is that unlike in other disciplines, such as anthropology, literature, and cultural studies, which are equally concerned with issues surrounding the global south, the religious studies accent on non-Western Christianity has made significant shifts in the interrogation of perspectives, approaches, paradigms, and implications that affect Christian realities outside of the West. In my opinion, Christian religious scholarship has not really been concerned with understanding the social, political, historical, cultural implications uncovered by these perspectives. I must thank the last speaker for talking about polygamy. I just came back from Nigeria. I arrived on Monday. And during my visit, I ran into a childhood friend who is now a big shot in Nigeria. How he reminded me of something that happened in 1958 when my father was a priest in his local church and we were classmates in the primary school. He said, "Jacob, do you remember that your father did something to us that wasn't too good? He prevented my mother and members of my family from taking the Holy Communion because they were accused of polygamy." So in other words, as you just said, the CMS forbade them from taking Holy Communion because they belong to these polygamous families. Can you imagine almost 60 or 50 years after that? My friend reminded me of what happened when we were young. This is why this initiative is very important to us, particularly historically, socially, and culturally. Thus, the question from contemporary scholarship should not be whether Christianity in the global north still matters. The global north may no longer be the normative center of world Christianity, but as scholars, we should be more concerned with the political, social, and religious implications of the shift, the world Christianity from the north to the south, and what this means for this age-old faith tradition today. As we all know, the shift is reflected demographically and geographically. How many Christians are there in the world today, and where are they located? The statistics are constantly, coming up, and some of us do take the statistics seriously. The historical transformation of Christianity as a world religion is important and calls for significant re-examination of how Christianity should be studied. Where is it studied? Who are the key figures and groups involved in the study? And what are the problems that scholarship faces today? For example, what does it mean for us to see the once vibrant seminaries in Boston, Andover Newton Theological Seminary, and the Episcopal Divinity School closed right before our very eyes? Why countries of the global south are desperately looking for spaces to train their emerging scholars and clergy. Occasionally, I go to some of these new movement, Pentecostal, charismatic evangelicals, and as I walk in there, they will, introduce some pastors, some people, say, meet our theologians. And of course, I know they never went to any solid theological schools, but they are already using our vocabulary to call them theologians. What does that mean for us? And what does it mean, the study of world Christianity? However, as I argue in a keynote address at a conference similar to this one at the Princeton Theological Seminary in February 2018, we must be careful not to assume or think that the center of gravity has completely shifted from the global north to the global south. The resources, personnel, infrastructures of world Christianity are still firmly based in the global north. At this particular conference I refer to, the three key professors who organized it are from the global south, but they work at Princeton Theological Seminary. They were responsible for, for organizing the conference, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So the question is, for me, and I think for some of us, that he who pays the piper dictates the tune of global Christianity, in which we are all engaged. So what global Christianity means to me then begins from this positionality and these conceptual constructs. In other words, I don't want us to begin to deceive ourselves about this shift from the north to the south. We need to understand the realities that we are faced with. One of the things I said this morning in talking to my colleagues at Harvard is that in terms of the numbers of students who come to the Divinity School, there are very few from Africa. It's so expensive to bring African scholars and African students to come to these places to study. So what does that then mean? My own position is that we need to shift the focus of how we train these students. And right now, since 2017, I've been involved in what I call a summer institute in Nigeria, which is of course an African-based one, whereby we bring professors from the north, Europe and America, and also other African countries to Africa to train, to help in training pre-doc and post-doc students and scholars in the social sciences and the humanities. It's a success story. If you want to know more about it, I will let you know. The first thing I want to look at is global Christianity and the global south, issues of definition and identity. What does the field of global Christianity mean in the African context? What will the pursuit of a new areas of scholarship contribute to the understanding of Christianity in Africa? And how does it differ from previous approaches to the study of African Christianity, particularly what is normally referred to as missiology and church history? And what are the major themes in world Christianity that are germane to African scholarship today? I do not regard the distinction between world Christianity and global Christianity as important. I'm referring to the suggestion made by my senior colleague and late colleague, Professor Lamin Sani. The distinction for me appears to be one of semantics, because both terms refer to the study of Christianity in contemporary global context as a form of world religions similar to the way that Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism have been understood. The caveat, however, is that the term raises a pertinent conceptual issue worth considering. For a long time, world religions were regarded as those traditions that followed Karl Jasper's and later Eric Voegelin's scheme on axial age civilization, including Christianity. And those of us who went to graduate schools in the 70s and early 80s will remember how important it was for us to read these two texts. These religions were regarded as traditions that arose at a certain historical period, defining the legal tone and identities of the so-called higher religions. While Christianity has always been considered a veritable member of this club, it was primarily seen in its Euro-Christian context as a tradition that was subsequently spread to the southern hemisphere through European missionaries. This tradition produced the normative framework of Christianity around the globe. However, all recent available statistics suggest that the demography of the Christian tradition has emerged from these old mission centers in Africa, Asia, and so on, have now surpassed the Christianity of the northern hemisphere in numbers and influence. This development is leading towards a necessary rethinking of the nature, status, and power dynamics in the Christian faith tradition across the world. It is imperative, therefore, that we begin to attend to Christianity in the global south in innovative and creative manner. We must learn its content and understand its contours so as to give the Christian tradition there a voice in the conversation. Things have changed. It is no longer business as usual, and we must understand that. African Christianity comes to the global north. A brief general outline of Christianity in Africa today may look something like this. Africa, at the beginning of Christianity, asserted itself as a significant actor in the narrative of the Christian church. The early church, medieval Christianity, the Portuguese Christian mission that came in the 15th, 16th centuries, European Christian missionaries, independent African churches, the charismatic Pentecostal churches, in that chronological order, we all know. All of these may represent different epochs in the long line of Christian history on the continent of Africa. In writing the modern history of Christianity, African agency must be central to this new narrative that I'm talking about. But this means that quite a number of the received interpretations of Christianity need to be revised so that the important roles of Africans in the early history of Christian church can come to light. Having taught a course called African Christianity and Civil Society for many, many years, one major observation has been that the African sources for understanding this kind of exercise are often found in very remote places. One must then look beyond libraries archives, and even to books that originally would have been seen as marginal to mainstream Christian historiography. In order to be able to do that, we must then uncover the authentic histories of the Africans and the roles they played in the formation of the Christian church on the continent. For example, I remember, one of the blessings of my life was that I was able to go to many places with my parents. They were missionaries. I used to tease my father I was a missionary, a local missionary in Nigeria. And everywhere we went, the natives would create language, vocabulary in the Christian tradition to describe their experience as Africans. We can finally find any of this thing in any book, in any library. How do we then understand what we regard as, say, African Christian experience if we don't take very seriously this particular phenomenon? The second consideration to examine is the history of the African Christian encounter with the global North itself. In 1990, I coined the term reverse mission. If you've seen that term, that first came up in 1990 when I had a project to address. The term describes the phenomena of Christian missionaries entering spaces in Northern Hemisphere, particularly the United States, Europe, and to some extent Asia. Christian missionaries from the continent use this term themselves to describe their understanding of the nature of their mission and evangelical activities in America and Europe. The term, of course, plays upon the idea of the 18th, 19th century European missionaries who were sent by their churches to evangelize Africans. As product of this evangelization, Africans now feel empowered to return to the old mission post and embark in reverse on the same kind of missionary work that their great-grandfathers witnessed in Africa. There is a sense now that it is the West which requires evangelization. And so Africans have taken up the charge and entered in the global North. In reality, we can count the presence of African missionaries in our midst through the lens of this African missionary themselves. All we'll have to do is to look at what happens in Kiev, in old Eastern Europe, when a missionary called Pastor Adelaja began his evangelization mission. And very soon he virtually took over the whole place. Russia paid attention to him. He influenced the election of the local mayor of the city. And he became pretty important until, of course, they scandalized him to find a way of driving him out. Similarly, another thing happened in England when a Nigerian missionary started his own church based on this same notion of reverse mission. By the name of Ashimalo, he flowered very well. He had thousands of members that converted or that came with him or that also joined his church. And all of a sudden, when Britain noticed that he was trying to get out of order, they decided to cut him to size by making sure that he would not have he wanted to build his church at the center of London. The moment you hear the word Kingswood Parish and Kingswood this and Kingswood this, you know there's something there. So they quietly said to him, you know what, you should pack your loads and go back to your country. You don't belong here. So the tensions between the South and the North is clear. The numbers are amazing. And Europe is taking notice, and Europe is scared of them. So all over Europe and United States, for instance, one finds African Catholic priests working in different dioceses, just as the European and American priests did in Africa years ago. So the idea of reverse mission, however, should also be considered in view of distinct encounters between the global North and the global South, particularly in the interaction of new immigrants and their host congregations. Several years ago, I was in Miami as a visiting professor. And one of my students said, Professor, we would like you to come to our church on Sunday. In good faith, I took that. It was a time when you have to have a cell phone and you have to be able to speak Spanish to enjoy life in Miami. And I didn't have any. So I went to this church. What did I see? The homily was given by an Igbo Nigerian priest. Flawless Spanish. So we got out and I said, come, my brother, you are a Nigerian. How did you get here? I found out that this guy speaks French, Italian, Igbo, Spanish, and of course English. He was fully in charge of this church in Miami. Let me quickly move to the next one. African Christianity, indigenous knowledge, and contextualization. Reflection on global Christianity and the role of Africans requires that we take seriously African culture and tradition. A key instance of this pertains to the rise of Pentecostal charismatic movements in Africa. Some African culture experience this movement as altering certain cultural traditions, or what I would call a deculturalization process. In other words, the new Pentecostal charismatic encounter that we're having is taking a totally different take on what we often call culturalization in the 60s and so on. The opposite of this enculturation, which encourages Africans to explore Christianity within the parameters of African culture and tradition, was a topic of fruitful discussion and debate in the Second Vatican Council, the result of which was the process of Africanizing or contextualizing certain European Christian traditions on the continent at that time. This period witnessed the flowering of Christianity in Africa as a result of the Christian encounter with African indigenous institutions. It was the era when African Christianity was given the platform it deserves. One of the reasons why the independent African churches flowered after the era of the mission churches was because they had the space to Africanize European Christianity. In the more contemporary period, the period I refer to as the Pentecostal charismatic period, the deculturation process of Pentecostal charismatic spirituality, a movement that has provided significant mileage to Christianity on the continent, will, I believe, ultimately deprive Africans of their Africanness, their Africans' identity, including their language, liturgy, dresses, the old notion of extended family structures, and so on. I don't have the time here to talk about the nitty-gritty of this particular process. But one of the things that is very disturbing to us is that the kinds of African institutions, rituals that were created through this process of the independent African church movement are now being turned on their heads by Pentecostal charismatic institutions and so on. Just as Lamin Sane, a major work translating the message, the missionary impact on culture, emphasized the importance of the Bible, the translation of the Bible into native languages. I remember Professor John Mbiti telling me years ago when I was trying to, do a book in his honor, that whenever the Bible is translated in an African language, people go wild. They're able to read the Word of God in their own native tongues itself. So what does it then mean today for an African bishop to say to members of his diocese, do not use Yoruba or Igbo in liturgy. You have to use English language. I certainly know that Bishop Crowder, who took the time to translate the Bible into Yoruba language and part of Igbo language, will really be unhappy in his grave, listening to what the African bishops are doing. So this critique and many others should also form part of the conversation in the study of global Christianity. I should quickly add that the popularity of the Pentecostal charismatic movement, both in its local and transnational and global forms, have further eroded the extended family value system, vernacular languages, and imbibed a new form of ethics that supported the autonomous individualism, global capitalism at the expense of communal life-affirming ethos. Next, reimagining Christianity in Africa as a world religion methodological consideration. I would like to now turn to a few methodological issues. In today's academic field and in the intellectual pursuit of knowledge, the signs of progress are often seen through theoretical innovations that encourage scholars and researchers to deploy imagination to rethink the theory and methods that have been in currency over a period of time. That is why in all our schools, particularly in the seminaries, we keep creating what they call method and theory courses for whether they are MTD or MTS, and we'll try for 2-3 years. We'll say, no, there's something wrong with this. We now begin to change that. And at times, we are so confused about what we mean by that. We reminded ourselves this morning when we were discussing this same problem. Now, and why world Christianity has, spoiled us into developing conceptual analysis and unearthing historical, political, social, and mythological issues that are maintained germane to the study, I believe that we are very much in a deficit of innovative theoretical insights that could move this conversation forward. This is a matter we need to attend to urgently. Several recent developments in world Christianity discourse call for creative exercises, such as the old one that we used to witness. I refer here to the very important article by Robin Horton, on conversion, which is still cited today. If you're working on conversion anywhere in the world, you have to cite the Horton's example, which was based on a review of a book by J.D. Whitepale on Aladura Christianity in Nigeria. What I'm trying to call for here is that kinds of creativity, that kinds of innovation that will move the field forward so that we begin, of course, to see our roles as scholars and interpreters in new light. Let me further lay out a few illustrations that could lead to deeper reflection and possibilities in theoretical innovation. At every age and time, we often talk about religious fashion, what is in fashion in societies and cultures. This will refer to religious trends that are spearheaded by one form of Christian belongingness or the other, that are then replicated by the entire society, but not necessarily only by members of our own religious tribe. For example, why do the mainline mission churches and Aladura independent African churches today tailor their religiosity towards more evangelical Pentecostal practices and habits that are often associated with specific terms of Christianity discernible in Pentecostal charismatic movements? What I'm trying to say here is that as we look at the African field, we can say with certainty that whereas all Pentecostal charismatics are evangelicals, but we cannot say that all evangelicals are Pentecostals and charismatics. So we must ask ourselves the questions. Why is it that the Anglicans and the mainline churches and the independent churches, why are they trying to behave as Pentecostals, charismatics? These are issues that I think very important thing that we need to answer. So are the mission churches and the Aladura churches also Pentecostal? If the answer is no, then we require a new nomenclature and rubric that will embrace both the apples and oranges of Christian expressions in contemporary Africa. Can we talk about evangelicalism as a unifying descriptor for all who fall under this form of Christianity? If the answer is no, we must then be able, at the very least, to explain why the Methodists, the Anglicans, and the Aladuras want to be like Pentecostals. Why is it that Pentecostal Christianity displays and maintains its form of religiosity with significant success, at least from our own reckoning, with little or no theological education? Why is it that Pentecostal charismatic churches in African societies and nation states have become more visible in the public sphere than the old denominational churches, even to the extent of being regarded as state religions. I remember again from my own experience in 1970 or so, when the Anglican, the entire church was called to the palace, to the governor's office for the normal annual prayer meeting, and they all put on their robes. And the Aladura, Independent African Church had this heavy stuff in there. And my father, who was like the head of the church at that time, because of his training in Western theological education, he had a church in England for 2 years, told the man that he should go and stand at the front. He's not supposed to be standing behind him, because in the procession, and of course, in the African context, that procession is very important. The big chief will stand at the back of the procession. Now, if you fast forward, that kind of thing will not happen again. So the state church, if you like, is no longer the Anglican or the Methodist. They're the Pentecostal charismatic churches. What does that then mean for our study and the kinds of scholarship we are pursuing? As an interdisciplinary endeavor, scholars should also borrow tools from the humanities and social sciences to engage in interdisciplinary work. Ethnography, historical, textual studies, and other scholarly approaches that are amenable to research in world Christianity. The effect of such radical scholarship, if we may call it that way, is that it will lead to a reinterpretation of what world Christianity is in both time and place. It reflects on the already existing published materials that came out of the scholarship of the previous era, scholarship that contains significant biases and partnership, and that excluded the very agency of the subject that the research itself was focused on. There's a need for us to turn this thing upside down. The new approach I'm calling for may be revolutionary, in context, because it's going to query all the received knowledge of the Christian traditions and their interpretations among native Africans. I'm going to fast forward pretty quickly and talk about Christianity's public presence on the continent. Christianity and the public sphere is another important category that requires significant attention. And I may just, by extension, talk about even public policy as it relates to the role of the Christian tradition. The public sphere has become a major theater for not only the practice and expressions of Christian tradition in Africa, but also as a zone where major contestations of identity and power relations take place, particularly between the church and the state. It has also become a stake for question of justice, human rights relations between Christians with people from other faith traditions, particularly Islam. That is where the issues of Christian-Muslim relations in Africa is very central, and we need to focus on that. In the 1990s, African Christianity acted both locally and globally through its role in civil society following the decline and demise of USSR communism and Eastern Europe. I'm here referring to the role of the church, particularly the church, in the redemocratization process. Most of them were involved in the drafting of constitution for the state. They were involved in the election. They were actively involved in making sure that a new order takes effect. And I think we also need to look at it in this context. It's also well known that religion is often able to articulate tensions and contradictions about identity, citizenship, and belongingness in any given society. What then is the role of the scholar in examining these questions in the face of social realities of Christians on the continent, particularly in those places where Christians may be in a minority, or even where Christians are not necessarily a minority, but because of the kinds of conflicts that are arising from the encounter with, say, Islam. and Nigeria is a classic example based on your knowledge of Boko Haram and other things. Let me now conclude that I've tried, at least in some of this, to discuss what I would consider to be some of the scholarly and heuristic importance of the Global South as part of this entry into this conversation on global Christianity. But I've also tried as much as possible to look at what is shaping the conversation, particularly in relation to the intersection between global South and global North. And with particular reference to African context, which is my own different areas. But by implications, some of the things we are talking about do have impact on the larger spheres of global Christianity, be it in Asia, in Latin America. Let me also quickly add, and this is not quite in my note, I've been having some conversations with Christians from the Middle East, those who were driven by the wars in Syria and all these places, who have found themselves in America. And they keep asking, anytime, I introduce myself as a professor of religion, and then they go, oh, are you a Christian? And I say, yes, I'm a Christian. You know fully well, but in terms of their own identity, their names are usually very, very Middle Eastern. It's like Islamic names. Even in Nigeria, you hear of Canon Mohammed, Father Kuka, Ibrahim. These are all Muslim names, but they're Christians. And the major question they ask me is that, is America a Christian nation? Well, I said, I don't know. Why is it that they have abandoned us? What is our role as scholars, particularly in the context of persecutions that Christians face all over the world? Are we in a position to enter the conversation? Are we in a position to enter the dialogue? Do we, based on the kinds of training that we have had in the secular context, even if it's called a Chicago Divinity School or it's called Harvard Divinity School, there are certain value systems that are promoted. Are we, allowed to intervene in this? And when we ask these questions as scholars, what answers do we give? Are we qualified to give the kinds of answers? A number of them are seeking for help. A number of them are seeking for answers to some of these deeply rooted questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for yet another compelling paper. I would actually invite our speakers to come on up here, if you don't mind taking a seat at the table. And we have a fair amount of time for questions. I will do my very best to keep a list of who has their hand up, and I will keep scanning the room. And so if you have your hand up and I sort of nod at you, you can take that to mean that I've written down some description of you on my list so I can call on you. So, yes, we can start with you.
Hezekiah is real peace be upon you. And I'm very concerned today with people, with society, and where Christianity has become. And on three major things that I'll just say briefly, and would like your guys' thoughts and inputs or any rebuttal on it. But the first thing, the major thing to me is Jesus is being taught as being Almighty God, which is not something he proclaimed to be. He proclaimed to be the begotten Son of God, begotten being born or created of the Father, whereas the Father is unbegotten, uncreated. He always was, is, and will always be. And the worship of God is what Jesus taught us to do. And as a matter of fact, when Satan tempted Jesus, he made him to bow to him. He said, "Don't flee from me, for God alone we're to serve, and him alone we're to fear." He didn't say himself and God.
Excuse me for 1 second. If you could actually be just a shade more succinct in asking the question, so there are 3 things. If you take this much time with all 3, we're not going to get to any other questions.
Okay,
so
I'm
you
trying
go
to be
ahead.
brief. So I guess the first major concern I have with where Christianity has come today is amalgamating Jesus with being Almighty God. That's the first problem. The second is the thinking that once you're saved, you're always saved, removes the fear of God. And the fear of God is what we need to overcome sin and lust in our life. You know, I don't know if you guys know, but a lot of killings going on recently, both in churches, in mosques, synagogues, and of course there's always going to be evil in this world. But a lot of this stems from bad teaching, where people are not being taught that there's a judgment day coming, where God will execute judgment on everyone for how they live. And that's not being taught.
So you need to get to your third point.
Third point is the commandment not to kill was to include the animals, which I can show and prove through the scripture. One of the reasons Jesus was born in a manger next to animals was to signify he was coming to bring peace to man and animal. When we kill animals, either their flesh, chicken, steak, pork, meat, fish, we partake of the body of them, bring death to our own bodies. Eating causes heart attacks and cancer, and these things are being covered up. There's ancient documents out there that show Jesus was a vegetarian. He taught. God never wanted him. So these are the 3 things that I'd like your guys' feedback on these major concerns.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am ready to answer this very provocative questions. I think that is really the definitive question. That is, who are the Jesus that world Christianity is talking about? Isn't it that definitive question? Wow. The definitive question can be answered in so many different ways. Someone sitting in a church in Shanghai today will be answering the question very different from the Pentecostal in Nigeria, or in Singapore, or in the Pacific. That is why there is no definitive way of responding. That is why Jesus' question, who do you say that I am, is preeminently relevant. That each of us who confess as Christians needs to answer anew. I answered it when I was 5, but today at 60-something, I needed to answer this very question anew. That is why I am in the postcolonial study of Christianity. Christianity cannot be just an oppressive force, an oppressive world religion, tied with imperialism. There must be something in that Christian gospel that can be emancipated, both man, for men, and for women. And for the animals too. I fully agree. We need to pay attention to the ecological disaster, not just for human beings, for animals, and for all planet. Thank you for those questions.
Well answered. What I may want to add to this is the fact that religious literacy is important. A lot of the problems and issues that we're faced with today will relate to religious illiteracy, irrespective of the tradition, whether it's Christianity or Islam or indigenous African religion. And the second thing is, like you said, there is no single way of interpreting the scripture or even interpreting religious traditions. That is why we have different denominations. In fact, to talk about Christianity in general or Christianities in general, it's a problem. And my own Anglican faith tradition will see things in ways that are very different from, say, the Catholic tradition. So the context is quite important. But I like the answer to the last question, because you are raising issues that has made scholars who are in the area of regional ecology or environment quite concerned with those issues. So I kind of know it.
Thank you, yes. My question derives from something Professor Fox said that sessions were voting speakers. In your presentation of the Church of the East, showed how the Church of the East represents something global, and in the medieval period. But then by the end, you were talking about global modernity. And I guess my question, this will be the parent of my own paper. One of the questions I have is, what are the stakes in labeling Christianity global and at certain times? But in particular, is it possible that by global Christianity, when we say this, we're actually talking about, I don't know if modernity is confusing, but we're talking about Christianity and heritage. Is that what global means here? And is that what global does for us?
Yes. Thank you very much. Can I begin, and maybe you can join the conversation? I have written an essay in the book, Teaching Global Theologies, in which I then talk about different conceptualization of global, 4 different conceptualizations. But here in my presentation, I was challenging the way of conceptualizing the world. That is, Christianity was from the Mediterranean, and then it went strictly to the north, without looking at the east. And that was a skill for me, picture of the world in that particular time, especially when Christians along the Silk Road played a very significant role, and especially in the Persian Empire. And then later, it was in that place that we can talk about the interaction, if not confrontation, between Muslims and Christians. So then, without looking at that trajectory, we would not be able to see world or global Christianity in its ancient and modern history. So I want to emphasize that. Then, when we talk today about world Christianity or global Christianity, are we talking about the modern period? Well, where is the modern period? Should we even construe that is this modern period, everything to self, contested, saying that why should history be then always marked vis-a-vis the West? Okay? When you study Chinese history, do you need to introduce modernity? Why and why not? Would that be an interesting discussion even? If we talk about, yes, this is a valid concept. When is modernity in China? Would we say 19th century? Or after 1970s? Can you see that? It's all debate. But I like the concept of global modernity. To contest the evidence, the global south is always underside. Can you see that? That is a geographical underside. Or even if you have modernity and complementarity, it did not contest modernity, it's just Western modernity. And the Chinese scholars, yesterday and today, are saying socialism with a Chinese characteristic. What is that? That is, there are other ways of conceptualizing socialism. If there are other ways of conceptualizing socialism, there might be other ways of contesting modernity or contesting world Christianity.
Well, my response was simply to say that a number of these terms that we're using, including global, the terms are not new. What is new is the terms are new, but the ideas and the concepts are not new at all. One way for me of interpreting the Pentecost experience at the beginning of that very critical stage was the call for conversion and the fact that you should go and make disciples of all men. In other words, an invitation to a kind of a global tradition that you need to take from that particular spot where the disciples met, and Peter preached his sermon to the other parts of the world. In other words, the need to move the Christian faith based on this understanding of different languages and tongues to the different parts of the expansion of Christianity. That is global. It's almost a phenomena to a global tradition. So, but the fact that we're simply just invoking the word global, like globalization in the contemporary period, should not make us kind of forget that the importance of that experience as a global experience, so to say.
Yes. Thank you for two really amazing presentations. It's a great way to get the conversation started here. And I have kind of a question that comes from my own area of study right now, and directed more to you, Jacob, about, you mentioned that the collapse of Anglican theological schools in Nigeria and other places, and the ways in which the mainline Protestant denominations are kind of Pentecostalizing. That was a pretty question for more Christianity today. I wonder if you have some initial thoughts about why that is. Why are they Pentecostalizing?
Well, first of all, part of my issue, and I think the blessing, like I said, was that I was born in the Christian in the vicarage. I was born in the families of priests, my father's side, my mother's side, and I was actually physically part of that church personage experience. And I published a book called In My Father's Personage, the story of an Anglican family in Nigeria, where he talked about his work in different places. And so, as I look at that experience of growing up as an Anglican, in the Anglican church in Nigeria, and the idea that in those days it was mandatory for Anglican, the Anglican pastors, particularly when they become canon, to have the English experience. All my uncles, my father, my uncle, they all went to England. My father had a church at Bristol for 2 years. And Church of England also sent people to Nigeria. They were usually be asked to be the bishop's chaplain. Some of them were responsible for designing the cathedrals, based on the fact that they had, knowledge of architecture and so on and so forth. So there was the 60s and 70s and 80s. If you fast forward now to the 90s and then the crisis at the Lambert Conference, people like us are not surprised at that. The question, the issue of polygamy we addressed much earlier. There was an issue at the Lambert in the 70s, 60s and 70s, when the church then decided, leave the Africans alone. They will sort it out among themselves. We mustn't take this to the council and vote on it. Because if we do that, even the fact that the northern church was much larger than the African church. At that time, maybe there were just 3-4 African bishops from Nigeria, and about 7 from the entire West Africa. They would have defected them and decreed polygamy. They didn't do that. So later on, everything changed. And then, there was a phase. It was a phase where the traditions, whether it was Methodists and Anglicans, followed a kind of a tradition that were highly overlapping. They were part of the global communion, the global Methodist, global Anglican, global Presbyterian. Now, you fast forward to 70s, and the new forms of Christianity that we now call the Pentecostal charismatic came on board. Responding to both local and global factors. Part of it is economic. Part of it would be a kind of a revolution that was similar to the revolution of the independent African churches, who were responding to new ways of being Christians in their own local context. So, unfortunately, because they are gaining an upper hand, they are becoming, if you like, the state church. I once talked about the fact that if the president of Nigeria calls a meeting in Lagos, and the president and the GO of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, the largest Pentecostal in Africa, calls for a similar meeting, more people will go to the Redeemed camp than the meetings of the president. In fact, the political parties will have to bribe people to come. Whereas the head of the Pentecostal Charismatic Church, Adeboye, will not need to bribe people to come to Redeemed camp to listen to him. So we are seeing a kind of a change, a new sort of dynamism that we have to be careful in explaining, not to explain it purely in political and economic terms. Or a number of writers are saying that well, it is because Africans are poor, it's poverty, and so it is more than that. They're both the combinations of local and global factors.
There is a book that talks about Pentecostalism among the Chinese, both in mainland China and also in Chinese American communities. It is called, I think, Global Chinese Pentecostalism. I think that would be very helpful. But recently, I heard Professor Kerry Day from Princeton Theological Seminary, who talks about the origin of this Pentecostal kind of movement in Azusa Street. And then talking about the role of breadwinner, and then their prayers and their cultural expressions. And I was fascinated because then she emphasized the African American roots, or tracing back the African roots to that kind of worship and experience. And that is why I think that it is an embodied language. It is not just spoken, it is the bodies there. It is, I would say, an embodied cultural expression from the South. That is why now it is we embrace, or people welcome that kind of expression. And I think those kind of transcultural languages need to be taught and studied. And I am so grateful for your earlier work on women in India, and looking forward to your forthcoming research.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more brief question. If nothing else, it will help move the conversation forward even if we don't do it justice. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your persuasive papers, blind spots in the study of global Christianity and your own ways forward in scholarship. And I'm wondering how these developments that you speak about translate into your teaching. To what do your students, in what ways do your students respond to or struggle with these paradigms you presented, global modernity or polycentric theology on the one hand, the range of theoretical and methodological developments on the other, and what might you recommend to those of us who would attune our own teaching more closely to the same things that they are?
Okay, I will also add to your question, what have I learned as a teacher? When I first came back, I called it my second coming to America, and I designed a course to teach. And the students looked at it and said, Professor, we need to have a whole topic on sexuality. So we went back to the drawing board and designed that. Our students are pretty smart. They are very, very smart. And my own approach is to use multiple methods. Not only the traditional way of teaching as an African professor, which of course will include interactive sessions, but also making them to, if possible, go to some of those churches around Boston area. And when I was in California, around Sacramento, to observe as scholars, as you know, well, I still believe in the whole phenomenology approach, even though my colleagues have dropped it. But to kind of ethnographic, anthropologists who call it this, to go there and observe, and then we'll come back to have that kind of conversation. The other part of it is, I do not run away from difficult questions. and sexuality, as most of you will know, is a major issue. But I have become a liminal figure between here and the African sector. And thank goodness, the Anglican reverends and bishops are still willing to listen to me, to have a conversation. Because of why? Because my father was a missionary. Then,
let me just answer briefly. I think what we need is the decolonization of the mind. I was born in the former British colony of Hong Kong and have gone through rigorous colonial education. It took me a lifetime to unlearn, relearn, renegotiate all the educational processes I have experienced, both in Hong Kong and also in the United States. It is just so disappointing. My Korean students, they have never learned Korean theology until they took my course. Or the Chinese students never learned something about what I said this morning. So this is not acceptable. And then if we think the Asian Pacific is going to define the future of humankind for our century, we as scholars, we as teachers, need to turn to that particular area in our own study and in our own imagination. Thank you.
That was a really excellent question for us to focus on. Thank you for that. Please join me in thanking our speakers.